The Alpha Queen was driving her fiancé home from the merger gala when she saw her ex crossing the road with twins, and the car went so quiet I could hear my own pulse behind my ears. That fiancé was me. I want that said plainly, before anything else, because for 4 months I had gotten used to people assuming there had been some mistake, a clerical error, a cruel joke that put my name next to hers on a contract. There hadn't been a mistake. There had only been a Tuesday in April when I opened a shipping ledger nobody wanted opened, and everything after that stopped belonging to the life I used to have. But I'm getting ahead of the story, the way I always do when I reach the part that still makes my hands shake. Let me take you back to the beginning, before the gala, before the crosswalk, before I knew the words Alpha Queen could describe a woman who reheated my coffee without being asked. If you want to be there for the rest of it, subscribe to the channel now, because I promise you, this only gets harder to look away from. 4 months ago, I was Ivy Calloway, 26, Omega, 3rd floor payroll at Thorn Maritime Holdings, and functionally invisible. I had worked there 2 years without the executive floor learning my name. I answered to the girl with the ledgers when anyone bothered to answer to me at all. My coat was 3 winters old, gray gone to charcoal at the seams, and Priya from accounts receivable liked to accidentally tip her coffee toward it in the break room, loud enough that the room laughed before the mug had even finished spilling. I laughed along. Laughing along was cheaper than the alternative, and I had a 15-year-old sister at home who needed new cleats more than I needed anyone's respect. Everyone in that building knew one other name, and it wasn't mine. Callista Thorne. The press called her the Alpha Queen of Thorn Maritime, and they meant it as a warning, not a compliment. A woman who had taken a shipping company on the edge of bankruptcy and turned it into an empire by the time she was 30, who had fired a board member in the same sentence he tried to flatter her, who had not, in 6 years, been photographed smiling. I had never seen her in person. I had seen her shadow move behind frosted glass on the 31st floor exactly twice. And both times the hallway had gone silent the way a forest goes silent before weather. I was good at exactly one thing in that building, and it wasn't smiling. I could read a spreadsheet the way other people read faces. The wrongness announced itself before I understood why. Numbers that limped. Numbers that repeated in patterns too neat to be accidents. My manager called it obsessive. My father, before the accident that took him and my mother both, used to call it the gift, like it was something out of a story instead of a habit that kept me up past midnight cross-referencing manifests nobody had asked me to check. I found the wrongness on a Tuesday in a shipment log for a cargo route that didn't exist. $940,000 routed through a subsidiary dissolved 14 months earlier in an account with Julian Rourke's initials buried 3 approval layers down. I didn't know yet what it meant. I only knew it made the back of my neck go cold, the way a wrong sentence sounds wrong before you can say why. I saved it. I told no one, and at 4:51 that Friday afternoon, my desk phone rang with an internal extension I didn't recognize, and a voice I would later learn belonged to Marisol Reyes, head of executive security, said 5 words that ended the life I'd been quietly surviving. "Miss, Thorne wants to see you." I remember thinking, I've never once met Miss Thorne. I remember thinking, this is either the best day of my life or the last one at this company. I had no idea, riding the elevator up 31 floors with my chipped thermos sweating in my hand, that I was about to become the answer to a question the board had been asking for a year, and that somewhere behind that frosted glass, a woman with a reputation for never once losing her composure was about to lose it, quietly, over a girl in a second-hand coat who had found her $940,000. The boardroom on 31 didn't look like a place where careers ended. It looked like the inside of a glacier, white stone, gray light, 12 men and women in suits that cost more than my rent, and at the head of the table, a woman who did not stand when I walked in. Callista Thorne was younger than her reputation, which somehow made it worse. Dark hair pulled back hard enough to read as armor, a stillness to her that filled the room the way cold fills a house with a broken furnace. When she looked at me, I smelled her before I understood I was smelling anything at all, juniper smoke and cold brass, sharp enough to taste at the back of my throat. I had never registered anyone's scent that fast in my life. You flagged an anomaly in the Baltic route manifests, she said, not a question. Yes, my voice came out smaller than I wanted. Explain it. Now, to this table. So I did. I forgot to be afraid somewhere around the second sentence, because numbers were the one language I had never once stuttered in. I walked 12 strangers through 14 months of a dissolved subsidiary laundering freight fees back into a personal account, and I watched Julian Rourke's face go the color of the boardroom walls, and I watched Callista Thorne's eyes never leave my face, not once, the entire 7 minutes it took. When I finished, the room was silent in a way I would come to recognize later as her silence, the kind that made grown executives reach for their water glasses just to have something to do with their hands. Ms. Calloway caught in an afternoon what our external auditors missed for a year, Callista said finally to the table, though she was still looking at me. I want to know why. Because I read the whole file, I said. Nobody asked me to. I don't like when the numbers don't match what they're supposed to say. Something moved behind her eyes that I couldn't name yet. Later I would learn to call it the first crack. She dismissed the board. She kept me. And in an office 3 doors down, with the city going gold behind her at 6 p.m., she told me the second thing that would end my old life. Delivered as flatly as a weather report, her mother's will required her to be legally bonded before her 32nd birthday, 11 weeks away, or the board, Rourke's board, would seize provisional control of 40% of her voting shares. I am not asking you to love me, she said. I am asking you to marry me for 11 weeks of paperwork, and then let me make it worth your while for as long after that as you can stand me. You found the one thing in this company nobody else could find. I reward competence. I don't reward beauty, and I don't reward flattery, and you have offered me neither, which is the only reason I'm asking. I should have said no. I had every reason to say no. Instead, I thought of my sister's cleats and my mother's unpaid hospital bills, and the particular exhaustion of being unseen for 2 straight years, and I said the word that carried me out of my old apartment and into a car with tinted windows and a driver who called her ma'am, crossing a threshold I did not yet understand I would never fully cross back out of. The tower Callista lived in had its own weather, marble in the lobby that swallowed sound, an elevator that required a thumbprint, a penthouse with more windows than walls, so that at night the whole city seemed to be arranged for her personal viewing. My new apartment, because apparently a fiancé required an apartment 1 floor below hers, connected by a private stair, had a closet bigger than my childhood bedroom and not one single thing in it that belonged to me. I stood in the doorway of it that first night with my duffel bag and my thermos and felt smaller than I had felt in the break room, with coffee soaking through my coat. Callista's staff did not bother hiding their opinions. Her executive assistant, a razor-voiced beta named Priscilla, looked me over exactly once and said, to no one in particular, "This is what 11 weeks buys now," and walked away before I could answer. The chef refused to learn my name for the first 10 days. Only Marisol Reyes, gruff and gray-templed and built like a door, treated me like a person rather than a rumor, mostly by ignoring me entirely. which after 2 weeks I understood to be her version of respect. What surprised me was the food. Not the caterers, not the 12-course dinners Callista never ate more than 3 bites of, the small things. A jar of the ginger tea I'd mentioned once, at midnight, half asleep on a report. A grocery bag left outside my door, with the exact brand of oat crackers my sister liked, though I had never once said Junie's name in that penthouse. When I asked Callista about it, she looked almost offended to be caught. "I remember things," she said. "It isn't a virtue. It's a habit. It's the kind of habit that costs more than it looks like it costs," I said before I could stop myself. She didn't answer that. She just looked at me a beat too long, the way she had in the boardroom, and something in the room's temperature changed, though nothing in the room had moved. The Wealth Gap was a tour I took daily, wing by wing, and the sneering never fully stopped. But underneath it, in small, unadvertised gestures, tea, crackers, a coat someone quietly replaced without comment when mine went missing from the cleaners and reappeared as a soft charcoal wool that fit like it had been measured, I started to notice a woman being careful with me in a language she clearly wasn't used to speaking. The first time our hands touched was an accident, adjusting a cufflink she couldn't manage one-handed before a press call. Her skin was warmer than the ice water composure suggested it would be. She went very still. So did I. "You should tell me if that bothers you," she said quietly. "It doesn't," I admitted, and watched her exhale like she'd been braced for a different answer. There were things in that apartment I wasn't given yet. A hallway with one door that stayed locked, a silver-framed photograph on a shelf, always turned face down, that Priscilla dusted around without ever writing. Once, late at night, I asked Marisol, who used to live in the West Wing before it was closed off, and the older woman's whole face shut like a filing cabinet. "Someone who isn't your business yet," Marisol said. "Ask Miss Thorne when she's ready to be asked, and Ivy, when she tells you, don't run." The last one ran. I didn't know what she meant. I would, 3 weeks later, on a road with a crosswalk and a red light, and 2 small figures crossing it hand in hand with a woman I had never seen before in my life. The gala was the first time the world was told officially that the Alpha Queen of Thorne Maritime was engaged. I wore green silk instead of the gray coat, my hair up, Callista's hand at the small of my back like a brand, and for one entire evening under chandeliers, nobody in that room called me the girl with the ledgers. They called me Ms. Calloway, and some of them meant it as a threat, and I found I didn't care, because the woman beside me kept finding excuses to stand close enough that her scent, juniper smoke, cold brass, something underneath that I was starting to recognize as simply hers, settled over my skin like a second coat. "You did well tonight," she said in the car after, her hand loose over mine on the seat between us. The city sliding by gold and wet from a light rain. The board hates you. That means it's working. Is that a compliment? From me, it's the only kind I have. I laughed, and for one block, one whole ordinary block, I let myself believe this arrangement might become something with a softer name than arrangement. Then, the light at Holloway and 9th turned red, and Callista's foot came off the gas half a second before it needed to, and I turned my head to see what she was already staring at. A woman was crossing in the crosswalk directly ahead of us, an umbrella tilted against the rain, a small hand in each of hers, 2 children, maybe 5 years old, matching yellow raincoats, moving in the perfectly synchronized way twins move. The woman glanced up at our headlights the way anyone glances up at headlights. Then she saw who was behind the wheel, and she stopped walking in the middle of the crosswalk, and so did the car, and so for 3 full seconds did everything else in the world. I felt it before I understood it, the scent in the car curdling, juniper smoke gone bitter and sharp, Cold brass turned to something closer to burnt metal. Callista Thorne, who did not flinch, whose whole reputation was built on the fact that she did not flinch, sat frozen at a red light, with both hands locked white-knuckled on the wheel, staring at a stranger in the rain like she'd seen a ghost stand up and wave. Callista, my voice didn't sound like mine. Who is that? It took her 9 full seconds to answer. I counted every one of them. Daphne, she said, like the name cost her blood to spend. That's Daphne. The light turned green. The woman in the yellow raincoat scene finished crossing, pulling the twins along without looking back, and Callista did not move the car for another 5 seconds after that, staring at the empty crosswalk like it might still hold an answer if she looked hard enough. Who is Daphne? I said again, carefully, though some cold, competent part of me, the part that reads spreadsheets the way other people read faces, had already started doing the math on 2 small children who would be about 5 years old, and a locked door in a west wing nobody would explain, and a photograph that stayed face down on a shelf. Callista's hands finally left the wheel. In the glow of the dashboard, I watched her, for the first time in 4 months, look less like a queen and more like a woman standing at the edge of something she hadn't chosen to fall into. She was mine, Callista said. A long time ago. Before you. Before any of this. Her jaw worked once, twice, like the sentence had teeth in it going down. I haven't seen her in 5 years. I didn't know. She stopped. Started again, quieter. I didn't know there were children. The car sat idling at a green light, while the driver behind us leaned on his horn, and neither of us moved, and I understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had just watched a fortress crack down the middle, that whatever came next was going to cost both of us more than either of us yet knew how to pay. Callista did not sleep that night. I know, because I didn't either, and the wall between our floors was thin enough that I heard her pacing until almost 4, the way you hear weather move through a house before it arrives. By morning, she had become a woman assembling a war room instead of a fiancé. She called Marisol at 6. She called her family attorney at 7. By 8, she was standing in the kitchen in yesterday's clothes, hands wrapped around coffee she wasn't drinking, and when I came in, she looked at me like she'd forgotten I would still be there. I need to know if they're mine, she said. No greeting, no softening. Legally, biologically, before Daphne decides to use them as leverage, if that's what this is, I need someone I trust who can move fast and quiet through records without tipping anyone off, and I don't have that person. My accountants report to the board. My lawyers report to the board. You report to no one. You want me to trace it, I said. I want you to trace everything. Birth records. Custody filings. Where she's lived for 5 years and how she's paid for it, because Daphne never held a job longer than 4 months in the 2 years I knew her. Her voice cracked, almost imperceptibly, on the word new. I need to understand what I'm walking into before I walk into it, so I did what I was good at. For 3 days, I barely left the small office off my bedroom, coffee going cold beside stacks of pulled records. My one savant gift turned finally towards something that mattered more than a shipping manifest. On the second night, a storm rolled in hard enough to knock the power out on 2 floors, and Callista found me by phone flashlight, still cross-referencing, and instead of telling me to sleep, she sat down across the desk from me and started reading files upside down without being asked. You don't have to help, I said. I know how to read a spreadsheet, she said. I built an empire on freight margins. Let me be useful to something that isn't shareholders for once. We worked through the dark together, shoulders almost touching, her scent gone warm and close in the small room, and somewhere around midnight, counting candlelit hours instead of clock ones, she told me about Daphne without my asking, the way people confess things that have been sitting too long in a locked room. She left during my rut, Callista said, staring at a folder she wasn't reading. 5 years ago. No note. I woke up alone and assumed I'd done something unforgivable, because that's what my mother always said a rut alpha eventually does, becomes something a person has to run from. I never looked for her. I told myself I was protecting whoever she became by not looking. Her jaw tightened. If there are children who are mine, I let 5 years happen to them because I decided I deserved to be left. That's not a decision you made, I said. That's a story someone else gave you and told you to keep. She looked at me for a long moment, candlelight moving on her face, and said the thing that would become, without either of us knowing it yet, a promise tested by everything that followed. An alpha does not flinch. My mother said that to me every day of my childhood, like it was scripture. A ghost of something bitter crossed her mouth. I have spent my whole life not flinching, Ivy. I flinched on that road, first time in 31 years. Maybe flinching isn't the failure she told you it was, I said quietly. Maybe it's just what happens when something actually matters. I found the first thread of the real story at 2 a.m, buried in a wire transfer from 5 years back, $22,000 from a Shell account to Daphne Voss, 6 weeks before she disappeared, 1 week after Callista's rut. The account routing back 3 approval layers, the exact structural signature I'd seen once already, that Tuesday in April. On a fraud $940,000 deep. Julian Rourke's initials. I didn't say anything yet. I wasn't certain. But my hands had gone cold in the way they only went cold when a number was about to become a truth somebody had worked very hard to bury, and across the desk, close enough now that her knee brushed mine and neither of us moved away from it. Callista Thorne looked at me like she already trusted whatever I was about to find more than she trusted 5 years of her own guilt. We didn't kiss that night, but something opened between us in that dark office that neither of us tried to close again. A door, not yet all the way through, but standing ajar for the first time since I'd met her. The days that followed were the gentlest of the whole engagement, and I understood later that the story was giving us exactly that stretch of warmth because of what it planned to take back. Callista showed me the locked room herself, without being asked. It was a nursery that had never been used. Pale yellow walls, an empty crib, a mobile of small paper birds gathering dust, prepared by her mother decades earlier for whenever you finally let someone stay, Callista said, standing in the doorway like it still hurt to breathe in there. I understood then why the photograph on the shelf stayed face down. It was Callista and her mother, the last picture taken before the woman died, the woman whose voice still ran the household like scripture nobody had ever revoked. She built this room for a version of me she wanted, Callista said. Cold, efficient, married for advantage, children for legacy. I spent 31 years being exactly that, because it was easier than finding out what I'd be if I stopped. What would you be? I asked. She turned to look at me instead of the crib. I'm finding out, she said. Ask me again in a year. We cooked dinner together that week, badly, both of us, flour on the counters and a smoke alarm briefly involved, and she confessed, laughing in a way I hadn't yet heard from her, that she had once burned water trying to impress a date in graduate school. I told her about my father teaching me to balance a checkbook at 9 years old, calling it the gift every time I found an error, and how I still heard his voice sometimes when a number didn't sit right. We traded scars the way the wound-tending nights are supposed to go, not all at once, but scar by scar. Hers about a mother who mistook control for love. Mine about a father who died owing money he'd never told anyone about, leaving me to learn, at 17, exactly how far invisible could stretch before it broke a person. "You're not invisible to me," Callista said, low, on the last of those nights, her thumb moving once across my knuckles like she was memorizing the shape of my hand. "You haven't been since the boardroom. I don't know how to say things gently. I've never had practice. But I see you, Ivy, all the way through. That should terrify me," I admitted. "Nobody's ever looked at me that carefully before. Does it terrify you?" "No," I said, and meant it, and watched her breathe out like she'd been braced for a different answer, again the way she always seemed to be braced for the worst version of everything I might say. We didn't say the word love yet. But it was sitting in the room with us by then, the way weather sits over a coastline before it makes landfall. And I think we both knew it was only a matter of days. The days ran out on a Thursday. Daphne Voss requested a meeting through Callista's attorney, framed as concerned for her children's welfare, demanding what she called acknowledgement and support commensurate with paternity, a figure with 6 digits and a deadline attached. Callista refused to meet alone. I sat beside her at the conference table when Daphne walked in, and up close I understood immediately why 5 years hadn't dulled whatever this woman had once been to her. A poised, careful beauty, voice pitched like syrup over something colder underneath, the twins nowhere in sight. "Kept," she said, "somewhere safe, for now, in a way that sounded less like protection and more like leverage." "You look well, Callista," Daphne said, eyes flicking to me with a smile that had teeth in it. "And you've replaced me already. How efficient." "State your terms," Callista said, flat as glass. "My terms are that Rowan and Sage have a father who can actually provide for them," Daphne said. "I'm not asking for anything you don't already owe." I watched Callista's hands go still on the table, watched the old doctrine, "an alpha does not flinch," settle back over her face like armor snapping shut, and I felt the warmth of the last 2 weeks go cold in the room between us, replaced by something colder and much more familiar to her than I liked. 2 days later, the story broke anyway, despite the meeting, despite every promise of discretion. A tabloid headline calling Callista Thorne a deadbeat alpha who'd abandoned a pregnant Omega and 2 children for a corporate marriage of convenience. My own photograph run beside it under a caption that called me, cruelly, the replacement. The board convened an emergency session. Julian Rourke, of all people, stood up in that same glacier-white room and suggested, with poison's smooth concern, that perhaps Miss Thorne's judgment was compromised, that perhaps the company needed stability the current engagement clearly couldn't provide. Callista came home that night with her mask fully restored, cold in a way I hadn't felt from her since the boardroom, and when I tried to reach for her hand, she pulled it back, gently, like she was protecting me from something. "You should distance yourself from this," she said. "The press will not be kind to you." My family was never kind to anyone who stood too close. "Is that what you want?" I asked. "Distance? I want you safe," she said, which wasn't an answer, and I understood, standing in that marble kitchen with the smell of her gone cold and unreachable, that the woman who had told me she saw me all the way through was, for the first time, choosing not to be seen back. I went to bed that night having packed, without quite admitting to myself that I was packing, 1 bag by the door. I didn't leave. I want to say that plainly, because I came close enough that the difference still frightens me a little. What stopped me was the ledger. 2 a.m, sleepless, I opened the financial trail I'd started weeks earlier and finished what grief and pride had interrupted, the $22,000 from 5 years back, the routing signature. And now, fresh in the records, a second, larger transfer, $41,000 3 weeks old, from a shell account traced through 4 layers straight back to Julian Rourke. landing in Daphne Voss's account 4 days before she reappeared on that crosswalk. He hadn't just paid her to vanish 5 years ago. He'd paid her to come back, timed precisely to gut the board's confidence in Callista before the merger vote and the marriage deadline both landed in the same fragile week. Daphne wasn't the architect of this. She was the weapon, and she'd been handed to him twice. I found Callista at 4 a.m., standing at her wall of windows, still dressed, like she hadn't tried to sleep at all. "I found it," I said, and put the folder in her hands, and watched her go through 5 years of grief reorganize itself into 5 years of manipulation in the space of 11 pages. "He did this to me twice," she said, very quietly. "I flinched for a man I let sit at my own table. Then, let's make sure he never sits at it again," I said. "But Callista, when we take this to the board, take Daphne's exposure only as far as the truth. Don't destroy her past, what the facts require. She was used too, even if she let herself be. The twins will grow up in whatever story gets told about their mother. Choose the version that lets them still love her a little." Callista looked at me a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind her eyes. "You're the only person who's ever asked me for mercy in the same breath as justice," she said. "I know what it costs to be the person everyone decided didn't deserve softness," I said. "I'm not going to hand that to her children." She reached for my hand then, and this time she didn't pull away, and outside the window the sky was starting, faintly, to gray toward morning. The board reconvened at 9 the next morning, and this time I was not the girl asked to leave the room after her 7 minutes. I stayed at the table. I laid out 11 pages, 5 years of routing signatures, a shell account with Julian Rourke's fingerprints buried under exactly the kind of camouflage he'd once complimented me for catching once already, back when he still thought I was harmless. "Mr. Rourke orchestrated Miss Voss's disappearance 5 years ago and her reappearance 3 weeks ago," I said, my voice steady in a way it had never once been steady in that building before. Both payments traced to the same shell structure I flagged in April. He weaponized a family to destabilize a board vote he stood to profit from. The silence that followed was not her silence this time. It was mine, and I let it sit exactly as long as it needed to. Rourke's face went the color of the walls again, the same as the first time, and this time there was nowhere for the number to hide. Security had him out of the building within the hour, and by noon the district attorney's office had opened a file with my name listed as the source of record. Daphne, confronted separately, without the twins present, without an audience to perform for, finally cracked into something closer to honest. A woman who had taken money out of fear and desperation 5 years ago, and money again 3 weeks ago out of the same fear, dressed up as love for children she had, credit where it was due, actually raised alone and well. Callista, with a restraint I watched cost her everything she had, did not destroy her. She arranged instead for full custody evaluation, financial support for Rowan and Sage regardless of what came of the legal fallout, and a clean, quiet exit for Daphne from any further claim on either the company or the narrative, mercy exactly as far as the facts required, and not 1 inch further. That evening, the press that had called me the replacement 3 days earlier ran a different headline: "The Omega who caught the fraud that nearly toppled Thorn Maritime, twice. Callista found me on the penthouse terrace afterward, both of us still in the clothes we'd worn into a boardroom that had finally, fully seen me." The city was doing its gold and glass thing below us, indifferent to how close we had both come to losing everything in the same week. "I have spent 31 years believing love was a weakness my mother warned me about," Callista said, taking both my hands like she was asking permission for something bigger than the gesture. "I don't believe that anymore. Not since the boardroom. Not since the storm. Not since you handed me a folder that let me choose mercy instead of ruin. Is this a proposal or a performance review? I asked, because some habits, the joke instead of the flinch, I wasn't ready yet to fully retire. Both, she said, and almost smiled. Ivy Calloway. Tell me to stop, and I will stop, right here, forever. No consequence to you, no debt owed. But if you don't tell me to stop, I am going to ask you to be my mate in every sense of that word, not 11 weeks of paperwork. All of it. The bond and the bite and the 2 small children currently asleep 2 floors below us, who are going to need every ounce of steadiness both of us have. Don't stop, I said. Not ever. She kissed me then. Finally, fully, 4 months of careful distance collapsing into something warm and certain, her scent gone soft around the edges of the juniper and brass. Mine, she told me later. Breath against my throat, brown sugar and rain-warmed cotton. Apparently, the only thing in that glass tower that had ever smelled like home to her. The claiming came 3 nights later, unhurried, gentle in exactly the way 5 years of her own doctrine had told her she wasn't capable of being. She asked twice more before her teeth ever found my throat, "Tell me if this is too much," and then, quieter, right at the edge of it, "Tell me you're certain," and both times I told her I had never been more certain of anything, and the bond, when it settled into place, felt less like being claimed and more like something in my chest finally exhaling after 26 years of holding its breath. Marisol Reyes, arms crossed in the doorway the next morning, looked at the 2 of us over her coffee with something suspiciously close to warmth. 15 years I've worked for that woman, she said. Never once saw her wait for anyone. Not once. She nodded once at me, gruff as ever, and it was, I understood, the highest compliment she had in her. Took you long enough to catch up, Miss Calloway. The wedding happened on a small terrace overlooking the harbor. 6 weeks later, no press, no board, just the people who had actually earned a place there. My sister Junie stood beside me in a dress that finally fit right. Rowan and Sage, 5 years old and gap-toothed and utterly unbothered by the size of the ceremony, insisted on carrying the rings themselves and dropped one twice, and nobody minded at all. Callista's vows were short, the way everything true about her was short. You found the one number in my life that didn't add up, and instead of walking away from what it cost you to fix it, you stayed and fixed it anyway, she said. I don't flinch anymore, Ivy. I found out what I'd be if I stopped being afraid of it. I'd be yours. A year on, the West Wing nursery finally had a family in it. Rowan and Sage called Ivy Mama 2 for exactly 1 confusing month before settling, on their own decree, on simply Mama for both of us, delivered interchangeably and without ceremony. The way children decide the important things. Julian Rourke was 3 months into a federal fraud sentence, his name struck from every door in the building he'd once tried to steal. Daphne, in supervised, carefully rebuilt visits, was slowly becoming something closer to the mother she might have been without fear and Rourke's money steering her. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but no longer punished for more than what she'd actually done. I still kept the dented thermos, chipped and unglamorous, on the kitchen windowsill of the penthouse that had somehow, finally, become simply home. Beside it now sat a matching one, monogrammed, that Callista had given me the week after the boardroom, back when I thought it was just kindness and not, as she later admitted, the first evidence she had ever let herself want to keep something. 2 smaller mugs joined them eventually, hand-painted, one with a bird and one with a moon, chosen by 2 children who had never once been asked to sit quietly and wait to be noticed. On the morning I'm ending this story, the 4 of us stood at the wall of windows while the sun came up gold over the harbor, and Callista pulled me back against her, chin against my hair, the twins arguing cheerfully over a slightly burnt breakfast Marisol had reluctantly agreed to supervise. An alpha does not flinch, Callista murmured, an old line finally emptied of its old fear. My mother was wrong about a great many things. I think flinching for the right person might be the bravest thing an alpha ever does. I used to make myself small so nothing could take from me. I don't do that anymore. Being seen, it turns out, was never the danger I spent my whole life bracing against. It was the thing I had been waiting for, without knowing its name. The girl nobody once bothered to notice became the reason a queen finally stopped flinching, and neither of us has needed the doctrine of coldness since. The end. If a story about being overlooked until the exact right person finally does the noticing found you at the right moment, that's genuinely why I keep telling these, so if this one settled somewhere in your chest, subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you too. I'd love to know in the comments, if you were in Ivy's seat at that boardroom table, would you have kept quiet or spoken up the way she did? Tell me honestly. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon with another one worth staying up late for.